know that already, I think that I recognize there's a couple of phone numbers down there. The possibilities came so clear last Sunday.
Apparently the
Ray
stream is
McGovern,
working now.
Ray McGovern was saying that, you know, he's a good friend of Daniel Ellsberg's, and Daniel Ellsberg is somebody we've wanted to get and haven't known how to contact, and he's getting on in his years, and we could have him on Zoom. And he attended, and he spoke at Community Church before the Pentagon Papers even came out. And during Ray's talk, behind him, he had a photograph of Julian Assange, who he's very concerned about in this trial that's happening in England. And he's in phone contact with Julian Assange, and it occurs to me that there would be somebody who would be perfect for us to give the Sacco and Vanzetti Award to. That's a committee decision, but, you know, just saying. So anyway, welcome to Community Church. And I just wanted to start by saying that I had no mask, and suddenly I have 3 of them. And I want to mention Crystal Rollins Jackson, who is our publication and office manager, who made me this one. And I want to mention our friend Diane Issa, making fashion statement here, who made me this one. And this one just came in the mail from Eric Kilburn. He claims that this is the best one to have. It's called the N95. And he had some extra ones from construction work that he did. And so there's that one. And I had a thought, and I even Googled it. I want a Miss Piggy mask. I haven't found one yet, but somebody's going to think of it pretty soon. I've always loved Miss Piggy, and for a while I was calling Donald Trump a pig, but I realized what an insult that is to pigs everywhere. Enough. Dean, shut up and introduce these wonderful guests we have with us. Hi, Catie. Hi, Barry. It's so good to have you with us. It's just such a special thing from all these different places that we come together here. I remember when I met Catie, I was going up the stairs and she was coming down the stairs of an attic in Newton where Eric Kilburn, who I just mentioned, had his studio. And she was making a record there, probably her first one, and I was making a record, probably my second or third one, in that same very attic. And Eric gave me a little snippet of some of what Catie was working on. At that time, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Catie was a social worker. And then I remember I saw Catie again at some event at the Peace Abbey, which I mentioned just because I love the Peace Abbey, and Louis Randa is a good friend to this church. And we did some kind of event together there. I proceeded to not see Catie for about 20 years while her career just went through the roof and became just a national, well-known treasure of a songwriter. And she's come back into my life a little bit the last few years. I host some events in Watertown with the El Salvador Watertown Sister City Committee. And Catie has done 3 shows for us, and they have all been very special. You know, running coffee houses and cafes and events is thick and thin, mostly thin. And those 3 have been thick just because Catie is just such a wonderful, magnanimous, and well-known performer, and we've drawn really nice audiences. And here she is with us this morning. Catie, thank you so much for joining us. And I know it is because of her connection with Barry that I actually asked Catie to join us. I remember when Catie organized a whole series of house concerts all over the country, benefit for the Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And I was one of the performers in that mess of house concerts that were performed. So thanks, Catie. It's all yours.
Excellent. Well, Dean, I remember opening for you at the Peace Abbey, and I loved your show, and you've been an inspiration. So I appreciate knowing you for all these years as well. A couple days ago, I started a new song, so I thought I would play it because it's a song inspired by, um, you know, the world in Boston right now, and how we were going to have the marathon this weekend, and instead we find ourselves in a different kind of marathon. And so this is, I think it's called April in Boston, but it's brand new, so it might change as we go. It's April in Boston, I'm waking up early morning with the light streaming in. Then I remember in my gut, I'm waking up to the truth sinking in, as the birds sing to the empty streets and the bells ring for the marathon. The flowers bloom for the funeral wreath, and I pray for the end of this before too long. Ooh, ooh, ooh. My neighbor's walking up the steps in the evening, another day at the hospital. As we listen to an ambulance in the distance, like a song that no one wants to know. And the birds sing to the empty streets, and the bells ring for the marathon. The flowers bloom for the funeral wreath, and I pray for the end of this before too long. Ooh, ooh, ooh. And I dreamed I was standing in a crowd full of people. It felt so good, like it used to be. Cheering on the runners, headed up Heartbreak Hill, against the odds. We believe. Well, it's April in Boston, I'm waking up early morning with the light streaming in. Then I remember, so I'll do my part. All together it's our battle to win, as the birds sing to the empty streets and the bells ring for the marathon. The flowers bloom for the funeral wreath, and I pray for the end of this before too long. Ooh, ooh, ooh.
Thank you, Catie.
You're welcome.
Beautiful. It evokes so many things. It evokes this moment. It evokes the bombing, which was a moment when we were evicted from our own church space for about 11 or 12 days. We couldn't get near because it was part of the crime scene, and it was nothing but guys in hazmat suits all over that area. And this is as a surreal a moment as that was. But we come together. I just wanted to read a poem by the guy who brought Barry and me together. His name is Tom Pacheco. And that's when I was able to become Facebook friends with Barry. And when we were hosting Tom, and Barry told me about some people that he thought I should invite. We had Tom Pacheco. He has since become my enormous inspiration. 50 years of just incredible songwriting. I wish Tom well, and I hope we can share this moment with Barry and Catie, with Tom in some way or other. But here's the song that I think about, or the poem or song for this very moment. You gotta have hope when every card seems lost. You gotta have hope when you're double-crossed. You gotta have hope when every flower is dead. You got to have hope, even if it's just a thread. You got to have hope when every star burns out. You got to have hope. One raindrop breaks the drought. You got to have hope if you still have one breath. You got to have hope. There is a way out yet. You got to have hope when the rest lose faith. You got to have hope when you meet Satan's gate. You got to have hope when you're terrified and scared. You got to have hope when it's too much to bear. You got to have hope through the unending night. You got to have hope. You'll see the faintest light. A whole lot of hope creates amazing things. The most sacred sunrise you've ever seen. A whole lot of hope creates amazing things. The most sacred sunrise that you've ever seen. Tom Pacheco. I want to let you know that I've been down to community church pretty much every day. We lost our building superintendent and haven't quite hired the new person yet. So I've been down there just checking on things. It just so happens we have a restaurant in the first floor that is our main sustenance and helps us keep this thing alive. That restaurant is closed. It's a Clover, which is a well-known restaurant around Boston. There's 10 or 11 different stores, completely closed. And our upstairs neighbors are called Theater Offensive. There's about 10 people who work up there promoting LGBT theater throughout the country, and especially for young people. And they are all working from home, so that it's empty. It's also emptied out by another thing, which is that Luis Guzman, who is our janitor and our Sunday cook, fell ill with the coronavirus and was in the hospital for not this weekend, but last weekend. Luis, I'm glad to report, is doing well now, and he's fine. He's at home, quarantined. We also have a plumber whose whole family fell down with it and are recuperating and in quarantine. So we've been pretty affected and touched by that thing. But part of my being down there every day is that I've been in these marvelous archives of community church that we've celebrated. But you know, we've talked about this incredible history of this church, but have not really taken a look at these archives in decades. They've been just stuffed into a broom closet. And this was our chance on our 100th anniversary. We were founded in 1920 to bring them out. And I just wanted to tell you that we heard for the first time on this cassette a sermon by Donald Lothrop, who was our minister for 39 years. And we never knew exactly why, but this is living proof. It's the only recording I've heard of him. This man was on fire. He was a preacher like you never heard before, and he would raise his voice in the air in the spirit of peace and social justice. And he railed against the HUAC that investigated him in the 50s, and he railed against Vietnam in the 60s, and he did the same against those invading Nicaragua. He was a very, very Yankee cultured voice. He's 8th generation minister and preacher. Donald Lothrop. I'm going to digitize this and get it on our website. And there was also a talk from which I wrote down this little piece that I'm going to read. I just wasn't able to transcribe it, but here's what it says. And this is from our founder, Clarence Skinner. It says, "Out of the world's wide ways, we come to this, our house of fellowship and aspiration. Here may the evils which beset us be banished by the power of justice, the fears that haunt us be overcome by fresh insight, the doubts that drive us be dissolved into finer faith. Here, each in our own way, yet together, let us for a brief time look into the mysteries of life's beginning, the source out of which the endless eons roll and countless lives emerge, and with renewed hope, search through this maddening maze of things to find again life's aims and meaning, and above all, its glory. I love that. I just found that and wrote it out. Jack Mendelson, who was a minister at the time, claims that he thinks that it was Clarence Skinner, who was one of the founders of the church. But if you don't know, this church became enormously successful very quickly in the 30s. By the time the 30s were over, they were meeting in Symphony Hall, and 2,500 people might be coming to hear the likes of W.E.B. Du Bois, the likes of John Haynes Holmes, who was the minister of Community Church of New York, and would come up once a month to speak at Community Church. The likes of the Reverend Martin Luther King, who spoke in 1958. The likes of Thurgood Marshall, Henry Wallace. This is another just phenomenal. I found a typewritten transcript of Henry Wallace's talk at Community Church, or it sounds kind of weird to call it a talk, address, his oratorial sermon, whatever, and that he gave in 1951. And that's another piece that we're going to digitize and celebrate on our website, and maybe even have somebody read it at some point. So welcome everybody, and Charlie is going to do his magic with his very powerful finger on the click button of the mute and unmute, and ask if anybody has any announcements. I want to say that what's foremost on my mind is that word that Prisoners Legal Service, PLS, has filed a major lawsuit about release of prisoners who should not be inside. And they might be prisoners who are elderly, prisoners who are immunocompromised or have other conditions that may make them especially vulnerable to the cesspool of a coronavirus pit that is a prison, just as is a nursing home or an institution of any kind. Also, people awaiting trial need a new bail hearing. And finally, the one that hits us really a whole bunch is people who have been paroled and re-incarcerated on little dipshit technical violations. We have a couple of our prisoners, our members behind bars, who are in that category. And by the way, I'll tell you that they might call in. One of them might call in. Sometimes we've tried to coordinate this and have them call early at 11 a.m. before the talk, but sometimes it doesn't work out. They have to wait in line for a phone or something. So just in case we get a call, Barry and Catie, I hope you don't mind that we might just, at the end of the song, of course, wait till the end of the song, but Barry, maybe ask to interrupt and drop everything and just talk to one of the two that might call. One is named Lee Underwood, one is named David Jackson. So
absolutely,
let's keep that in mind. But that's all from me. I'm just the guitar player at Community Church, and I've just been on fire with what an amazing history this place has, and have recently taken on some other responsibilities down there. And so that's how I want to say, Catie, will you sing us another of your wonderful songs? I had this request, but you don't have to do it. I am touched by songs about the pets. And there's one that I asked Cozy Sheridan to do at Community Church about, it was an ad for her cat that she had to move and she was trying to find a home for. It was the most beautiful song ever. I don't know if you've ever heard that song, but it just had me in tears. And Catie has one that's about her two dogs, and I don't know if we'll get to it, but that's my request. But you can do anything you want. It's not the paragon of a statement of peace and justice, which is what we're all about here.
Yeah.
But, Catie, the floor is yours.
You know, it's
The
funny.
screen is yours.
I thought of some other songs that I could do, and now I'm trying to think.
Or do two.
I'll just do one so people can hear Barry shortly after. But I will try to do the one about the two dogs, because I know this is a time when we are spending more time with our pets, and we might be noticing more things about them. And this is a song about how two seemingly similar dogs are actually quite different. And it's called Our Two Dogs. Okay, here we go. I don't have the words in front of me, and I did not try this ahead of time, so don't try this at home. Okay. Here we go. She's a dog that likes to look out of the window. He's a dog that only likes to look at us. She's a dog that loves her independence. He's a dog that can't get close enough. Or she's the dog who likes to eat really quickly. He's a dog who only wants to pick. She's the dog who finds the bone under the couch. He's the dog who carries socks around the house. I love our two dogs. Oh, what good dogs. What do you mean? They're both white, fluffy dogs. 2, 3, 4, 1. They're so different. She's a dog who's out to pee, and that's that. He's a dog who has to lift his leg on every vertical object, even when nothing is left. She's a dog who will walk without disruption. He's a dog who has to stop every 2 seconds. She's a dog who likes to roll in a dead thing. He's a dog who won't go out if it's raining. She's a dog who will run right for the squirrels. He's the dog who loves the wind through his curls. I love our two dogs. Oh, what good dogs. What do you mean? They're both white, fluffy dogs. 2, 3, 4, 1. They're so different, and I like to say, even though though it's sappy, ooh, every day they make us happy. Ooh, our two dog. I don't know what happened there. I did it in a different key than I used to do it in. That's what happened. Dogs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good.
Go for the unrehearsed. There we go.
Thank you, Catie.
No problem.
So I get to introduce Barry. So glad to have you with us, Barry. And I don't have the introduction that I wrote up. So I just want to say that I think it's the first time you've addressed the church, but I think you've been there before. If I'm not mistaken, you did a retirement tour, and the local folks from AU had an event there celebrating your retirement. And
that is correct.
So you're familiar with our space and our vibe a little bit, and so you knew what you were getting into here. And again, we're so grateful that you're willing to be with us this morning under a little bit different circumstances, but we just embrace you nonetheless with us.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Apparently nobody can.
I can hear you.
Terrific. Well, thank you. Yes, the last time I was at the community church was actually the Saturday evening before the horrific Boston bombings. And it was a extraordinary event and an extraordinarily sad few days thereafter. But I do thank you for inviting me to come back. Here we are in the midst of a pandemic created by the natural order and being dealt with at the highest level in this country by someone who was possibly created in a laboratory. Now, I want to give the president the benefit of the doubt. It is possible that he has a medical degree from Trump University. Now, see, this is actually an illustration of the strange nature of what we're doing. Since I can't see most of you, I have no idea whether you found the last two sentences mildly amusing or completely repugnant, but I'm afraid that's the way it's going to be. I am both an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ and a member of the Supreme Court Bar. So in theory, I could forgive you this morning and then go on and sue you tomorrow morning. That would be in the unlikely event that I could find a court that's open. I do take the realm of the spiritual very seriously, and I take the value of our legal system very seriously. But most significantly, I think these realms need to keep a decent distance between them. Unfortunately, here in Washington, there are a lot of people who would like to meld the two together, and that can have disastrous consequences. Because of my quarter of a century association with Americans United for Separation of Church and State, there are many religious institutions that ask me to speak or sermonize and assume that this issue of true religious freedom is what I want to talk about. And there are, in fact, two very classic passages in the Christian Bible precisely on point. We're told to render unto Caesar those things that are Caesar's, and unto God those things that are God's. And then we find even more specifically in the Gospel of Matthew that Jesus warned that prayer is best done privately and not in public. Specifically, that passage in the sixth chapter of Matthew is very clear. It's what it says. And whenever you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, so they may be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. But whenever you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Now, for the biblical literalist, that might be all it takes and should be to end the effort to bring government prayer back to public schools. But the religious right has been arguing for government prayer since 1962 and considers that all who want a return of government-sponsored prayer, those who oppose it, they say are hostile to God and even have run a few right out of office. There's a foreshadowing alert here. People who are Bible literalists also tend to be highly selective in what they in fact take literally. Now, our president does want to return government mandated prayer to public schools, just as he regularly celebrates National Day of Prayer coming up just next month. And I've never fully understood what the government is supposed to do on that National Day of Prayer. They're supposed to encourage us, instruct us. But what does that mean? Are we supposed to pray harder or faster, louder, more frequently, or in the case of this administration, pray in English only? I prefer to pray on my own terms, and I do so regularly without the help of the president or the governor or any other government official. Now, I actually like those passages that I just mentioned, but some of you may have been a listener, and I was a frequent guest on Diane Ream's National Public Radio show. She once asked me what I like to preach about when I preach in a church, And I said, well, when I get asked to do a sermon, I like to talk about almost anything other than the separation of church and state, because I don't want to use those passages, even though they seem to make the case, rather than proof text something from my holy scripture. I prefer that people understand the purpose of the law, the purpose of the Constitution, including its First Amendment, when it comes to looking at religion and its role in public life. According to a recent Gallup poll, 28% of Americans believe the Bible is the actual word of God and should be taken literally, 28%. That's somewhat below the 38 to 40% who believe that, according to polling done in the late 1970s. 25% see the Bible in purely secular terms, as ancient fables, legends, quasi-history, or precepts written by human beings. And that's up from 13% in 1976. And I guess one could say the other 48% are somewhere in the middle. There was a book I had sitting on my desk for more than a decade by theology professor Wayne Grudem called Politics According to the Bible. It has, he says, Bible answers to almost everything, not just traditional issues that are frequently brought up by people on the religious right, not just about abortion, LGBTQ folks, but down to what he claims the Bible says is the next fighter plane to be purchased by the United States Air Force. And again, because I can't see you, I'm just speculating here, but I think some of you may be scratching your heads going, I wonder what that plane is that he's talking about. Well, the F-15 Raptor, of course. That's clear, he says, from Romans chapter 13, verse 4. Now, see, if you want to go the Bible literalism route, though, maybe there's another answer to the what should be the next fighter plane built. That the answer might be none. Perhaps remember the story of David and Goliath. David is offered a new helmet and armor and a sword to go fight the giant, and he says, no, I will just take a slingshot and my trust in the Lord. You could say, that's a statement about complete disarmament. Now, even with the most common, fervent, conservative Christian beliefs, it's really hard to find any connection at all to the text of the Christian Bible. Like, where in the text is there a basis for supporting a strong anti-abortion position? Well, the closest these folks come, and so many of them are my colleagues, my friends, I've debated them all. And the closest they come to an answer is to find some poetic passage like Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, which reads, before I formed you in the belly, I knew you. That's nice poetry, but I find it a pretty thin reed to make public policy. What do we know for certain about the topic of abortion from the text itself? The only thing we know is that in the time of Old Testament Israel, abortion was not the same as murder. And we know that because in the Bible text itself, there are different penalties. In the book of Exodus, in chapter 21, it makes it clear that if people are fighting and one of them injures a pregnant woman so that she miscarries, that person is merely fined. But if harm comes to the woman herself, the harming person could be executed. Different penalties for different actions strongly suggests to me that abortion equal murder was not the position taken by the persons who wrote the Bible. Now, Professor Grudem, who is actually a nice fellow, I've talked to him a number of times, but he also has conservative critics who say he's insufficient in his analysis of the Bible. He says they say he discounts the validity of law from the book of Leviticus, presumably such demands as that we stone incalcitrant children to death. His conservative critics also, citing a few verses in Matthew chapter 5, say he doesn't seem to think the political leadership is truly invested with all authority in heaven and earth. Now, of course, after this week, we know that our current president thinks he is all powerful under the Constitution, and he repeatedly says, as late as last night, that he's a strong Jesus supporter. Just 10 days ago, he started his daily coronavirus task force meeting in substitute for a campaign rally with the resounding words, "Happy Good Friday." I think it's safe for me to say I have never heard anyone utter that greeting at any other time. But perhaps we can't blame the president for making a few errors. You may recall that during the 2016 campaign, he was speaking at Jerry Falwell's Liberty University. I mentioned that his favorite Bible passage came in the book of 2 Corinthians. Now, again, I have never heard someone refer to 2 Corinthians as 2 Corinthians, although that's a formulation that sounds like the beginning of a bad joke. 2 Corinthians and 1 Ephesian walk into a bar. Now, again, maybe a few of you found that humorous. I said that once in Ames, Iowa. The first person during the question and answer period said, "Barry, how does that joke end?" This is one of the reasons, long before the bizarre caucus kerfluffle this year, that I have always wondered why Iowa gets to play such a prominent role in American electoral politics. Now, there are many things wrong with this idea of Bible literalism, wrong with proof texting from the Bible, aside from the selectivity of the texts that we take seriously. And I want to give you another example. Must we really believe that all knowledge is contained in the words of the text? Well, not if we take the text itself seriously. Why is there even a book called The Revelation of St. John if there's no possibility of receiving other revelations? By the way, back in the day when Stephen Colbert was doing interviews for The Daily Show, I was interviewed for several hours by him in a choir loft at a church in Greenwich Village. And I was able to correct him when he referred to that final book of the Christian Bible as Revelations. I had to correct that. That's possibly why shortly thereafter, he asked me if I got my theology degree from a pop-up ad on the internet. But I digress. There's also a wonderful passage in the Gospel of John where Jesus at the Last Supper tells his disciples, "Don't get too upset that I'm leaving," and then reminds them that there is a greater understanding to come after his death. There are some things, the writer of John says, there are some things that are too heavy for you to bear. And that what the writer translates as the Comforter will come after Jesus to tell you all things. And many interpret that word, the Comforter, as a reference to the Holy Spirit. And that leads to a pretty deep theology. It allows you to listen to the workings of the Spirit, however you understand that work to occur. I think to be trapped in a world of Bible literalism is to refuse to allow your faith to grow. And I think it should. Bible literalism also leads to efforts to defend and explain the literally impossible. I don't mean the miracles of Jesus. I mean, why did the ancient Israelites believe that the mathematical construct of pi was exactly 3? I used to do a lot of flying. I would not be happy to learn that any aircraft I was on had been built by a person who made the gears thinking that their circumference was equal to precisely 3 times the diameter, not 3.1416, etc., but exactly 3. That could be catastrophic. I had a fire in a small airplane once, and that was bad enough. I used to speak a lot in Tennessee. A fellow came up to me after one talk and said he used to be a devout Christian, but now he was an atheist. And I was curious about that because I've heard that many times. Occasionally I hear from atheists who say, I used to be an atheist, now I believe in God. But I asked him what changed his mind from being a devout believer in Christianity to now being an atheist. And usually when I ask that question, there's a pretty complex story that someone wants to tell, or they might cite a grand question like, where was God on September 11th? But this fellow just said he had noticed that in 2 books of the Bible, there were differing reports of the number of folks who returned from the Babylonian captivity. For him, it was all or nothing. That single discrepancy was enough to invalidate everything that he used to believe and live by. I don't think that Bible quoting contests are the way to legislate or decide court cases. This approach, using anyone's holy scripture, will not get us the best, the most moral, or the most constitutionally sound policies. So besides Bible literalism being a terrible way to make public policy, there's another problem with the way people look at the Constitution. Now, you're looking at a person who I think it's safe to say is the only human being ever to simultaneously work for the American Civil Liberties Union and work at the same time for Pat Robertson. And I feel like I need to explain myself. With Pat, I was the only progressive voice on his secular conservative network, which, like so many of his ventures, died as a complete failure within about 1.5 years. Well, Pat called me one day during the early Bush years and said, why aren't you people working to keep the State Department from helping Islamic countries when those countries may use Sharia law in their new governing documents? Why aren't you stopping this? And I told him I would think about it, but I was too busy trying to keep people like him using his version of Christianity to run the United States. Speaking of the Constitution, it's being shredded almost daily by the people appointed to the federal courts here, including the United States Supreme Court, appointed by President Trump and ratified by Senator Mitch McConnell as majority leader of the Senate. You know, back in the summer of 2016, Mr. Trump put out a list of individuals that he would appoint to the courts. He made no secret about it, and he's actually delivering precisely what he said he would. This puts his promise about the courts in direct contradiction to almost every other promise he has ever made. Remember the wall? Mexico's going to pay for it. We will deliver a better health care plan than the Affordable Care Act. I mean, these things sound almost quaint given the state we are in today. But this man is still, as my mother said, because she never said anybody lied, he's still fibbing just about the pandemic itself. If you want a coronavirus test, you can get it, he said. And then famously said in early February, we only have 15 coronavirus cases in the United States, and it will soon be down to 0. As of this morning, we know of 39,000 deaths. But he kept that promise, and he's been appointing some real doozies to federal courts. These judges almost to a person, and that would tend to be a white male person in the vast majority of cases, believe in something they call originalism as the only way to interpret the Constitution, particularly the Bill of Rights. This is the philosophy that the meaning of the Constitution must be extracted from the intent of the people who wrote it. The late Justice Antonin Scalia was a big proponent of originalism. It's the position articulated by forces on the secular right, like the Heritage Foundation, and the religious right, like the Family Research Council and the late Jerry Falwell's organization, Liberty Council. Now, this idea of originalism doesn't sound crazy until you try to figure out what the intent of the framers was. And that's where the problem really begins. Nothing but James Madison's notes of the debate in the first Congress on the Bill of Rights even exists no verbatim records at all. There was no verbatim congressional record like you can look at today. And maybe the congressional purpose is not the only thing we ought to worry about. Shouldn't the intent of the states that ratified the proposed Constitution and ratified the Bill of Rights, shouldn't that matter just as much? Scant records of any kind of those debates exist at all, anywhere. And why should we assume that a Congress that wrote with great specificity about some things, you must be 25 years of age, it says, to be in the House of Representatives. It doesn't say you have to be mature to be in the House of Representatives. If it said that, there are a few people who probably wouldn't be there. I don't want to name any names. Devin Nunes would be so vague about other matters. If you're going to be specific about some things and not specific about others, what does that mean? Freedom of speech and of the press. It could mean that they assume that the breadth of those promises would change. The meaning would change as the nation grew and the nation developed. Those are the phrases that so many judges have labeled majestic generalities, majestic generalities. Let me give you just one example. What is the press? Freedom of the press. Well, aside from giving speeches, newspapers and magazines were just about the only ways to communicate 200 years ago. And even the late Justice Scalia assumed the protections of the First Amendment were in fact applicable to radio and to television. So he was a quasi-originalist about that. But it gets more complicated. What, for example, do we do with something as complex as the internet, which of course was not even in the mind's eye of anyone, not even Al Gore 200 years ago? What about journalists? People who wrote for newspapers are obviously protected. But what about people who write for blogs? Are they journalists too? I think it's literally ludicrous to think that we could search within the so-called original intent to help us address those questions about contemporary ways to communicate. Now, the alternative to originalism is often called living constitutionalism. My friend and current law school dean, Erwin Chemerinsky, has been perhaps the staunchest and longest supporter of this view. He notes that, I'm quoting him now, there always has been a living constitution and hopefully always will be. The opposite of a living constitution is a dead constitution, and no society we will want to be governed under that. Now, the originalists assert that when you use history, tradition, precedent, and modern needs, as Professor Chemerinsky suggests, it will end up with a standardless evaluation of facts that lead to a kind of anarchic, individualized set of decisions. I beg to differ. See, I think you can read the Constitution as a moral document. Now, obviously, it had enormous moral deficiencies. No abolition of slavery, no voting rights for women. But in a sometimes fumbling fashion, I'd submit that it tried to do the right thing. Even after the amendments that attempted to accomplish a more fully just order in America, the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment that established equal protection of the law, and the not yet enforced Equal Rights Amendment, there's still a need to interpret the Constitution, and like it or not, the interpretation that ultimately matters is that of 5 members of the 9-member United States Supreme Court. Now, many books have been written on the way in which the document could be interpreted if one rejects originalism, and I'm not planning to summarize all of those here. But it's my view that the best alternative is to try to figure out the values that the Constitution as amended tend to reflect. So when the Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable search and seizure, it is supporting a core principle of being left alone, of privacy for all of us. And it means not only that the police can't break into your house, it also should mean that the things you write on the internet, the emails that you write, should be presumptively considered sacrosanct unless there is a good reason to investigate your property, whether it's your house or your electronic communications. And the Eighth Amendment bars cruel and unusual punishment. It suggests that such penalties are prohibited because somehow they are unconscionable. And we've reached a point in this country where the imposition of the death penalty is frequently cruel because so many of the techniques that are employed go horribly wrong. And it's unusual because so few people are killed by the state each year. It's cruel, it's unusual. Now, originalists would say, well, wait a minute, but we imposed the death penalty at the time the Constitution was written. It shouldn't matter that there were executions at the time of the Constitution, merely as much as that we're coming to see such actions as morally repulsive now. That needs to be taken into account. You know, when you look at the core values behind the 14th Amendment, it's about the equal application of the law. And it shouldn't matter as much that it was initiated as a response to the abolition of slavery, not as much as that it can be applied to other groups that we now recognize as having been the subject of institutionalized discrimination. This is not a great leap forward. So to determine that the LGBTQ couples in this country can be married, it's not the end of civilization, as some of my friends on the religious right predicted. It's just a natural extension of the idea that a fundamental right, like marriage, cannot be arbitrarily denied to a whole group of people who have been the subject of endless discrimination. The values in the principles need to be applied to the issues of today. We really are facing a crisis in the federal courts today, all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And this crisis is created because so many jurists directly or in more indirect, but still obvious ways, think that the laws of this country should be based on Christian principles as they understand them. The Attorney General of the United States is Bill Barr. He said recently that the country's biggest problem is that we no longer adhere to Judeo-Christian values, again, as he interprets them. He said in a speech recently, Judeo-Christian, they always have to say Judeo-Christian because they don't want to be considered people who have forgotten the Judeo part. Judeo-Christian moral standards are the ultimate utilitarian rules for humans, Mr. Barr said. They are like God's instruction manuals for the best rules of man and human society. Religion helps promote moral discipline. Since mankind is fallen, we don't automatically conform ourselves to moral rules, even when we know they are good for us. That's Mr. Barr. I think Mr. Barr is probably an adequate lawyer some of the time, but maybe if he wants to talk like this, and he does a lot, maybe he should be a preacher. Many of the most recent appointments to the federal bench are persons who adhere to that general premise. In those rare instances where some Democrat on the Judiciary Committee dares to ask even such a benign question as when they're questioning a would-be jurist, can you separate your religious beliefs from your judicial responsibility? The person is criticized she or he is criticized on Fox News just for daring to suggest that religion is even an appropriate question to be raised by a Democratic member of the Senate. Now, the critics do say correctly that the Constitution prohibits any religious test for public office. What they ignore is they're making sure that a judge understands that whenever she believes about her spiritual commitment cannot be added to the strictures of the Constitution itself. It's not an overlay. It is something to be practiced in your life, but not applied to decisions of the United States Supreme Court. Now, Barr isn't on the federal court, but he's, of course, instrumental in evaluating the people who do get placed there. And folks watching, more than 25% of all the federal appeals court judges on the 13 appeals courts we have in this country, which, by the way, is the stop for 98% of all cases filed in federal court. Supreme Court only takes 2%. 25% have been selected in the past 3 years by this president and affirmed by this Senate. And the Senate has approved 2 ultra-conservative, and I mean that in the worst sense of the world, members of the Supreme Court. As you shelter in place, take a look at just how religiously focused many of those 51 appointees are. Go to websites, take a look at what they've said before they were, in almost every instance, unanimously appointed with the help of every Republican and occasionally a handful of Democrats. I don't want to suggest that the rest of the appeals court judges are free of this kind of belief that the religion ought to be an overlay to the Constitution. Recently, J. William Pryor of the 11th Circuit, covering parts of the South, he was appointed by George Bush, and back at Americans United, I remember suing him a couple times when he was the Attorney General down there in Alabama. He's in line to be a Supreme Court appointment. He was appointed, as I said, to the Circuit Court by George Bush. I recently saw a decision in his circuit about a tax evasion case. And the majority of the appellate judges on that panel said that it was fine to dismiss a juror who said that he had had a conversation with God and that God told him that the defendant was innocent. 2 of the 3 judges said it was okay to dismiss such a person, but Mr. Pryor said, nope, that was just kind of anti-religious bigotry in action. Maybe he did talk to God. Maybe he did, but that conversation, you might say, ought to be left between God and the juror and not imposed on the court in defense of a tax evader. So whatever you believe about the rules in your Holy Scripture, if you have one, they go for it. Live your life that way. But please don't expect your city council, the state legislature, or the federal government under any president to use those texts to make policy. When you think about your courts making constitutional decisions, don't get too surprised, and indeed welcome decisions that are based on the commonly shared values we find in the Constitution as interpreted by judges seeking meaning in the 21st century, not searching through the drawers of people 210 years ago. 2 worst ways to make policy in America: Bible literalism, constitutional originalism. Those are the big faults that are going on here in Washington and around the country. I want to thank you, Dean, for having me again. I'd love to take a few questions so that we can find what's on your mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barry. Thank you, everybody who's tuned in, both our Zoom session, there's 17 people, and over on the YouTube, it looks like there's approximately 10. And it's a lot of folks whose name or number I don't recognize. So welcome to all of you who tuned in. Find out more about Community Church when we're actually able to come back together. Sign up to our mailing list and join us as members as well. We're always looking for you. It's so strange to be a place whose whole intent is to gather people together, yet in this moment stay away, don't come anywhere near. It's very hard. During Catie's song, we're going to pass around the plate, figuratively, of course. I should have brought an actual basket. We have some beautiful baskets, but I want to ask you all, especially in this moment, to think about Community Church. We own a 5-story office building in Copley Square. We mostly live on the rental income from the first floor, which is a restaurant, which is closed. That is what the financial picture looks like for us in the next few months, or hopefully sooner than later. But it's a big question mark, and we need everybody's help at this moment more than any other time that I can think of in the past. Our budget is out the window, and we are hoping that we can continue with our programs and our staff, but keep that in mind as you go to our website and you click on the donate rectangle, and you can use PayPal and you can use a credit card. You can send a check to 565 Boylston Street, Boston 02116, or you can just wait till we're back again. But I needed to say that because this is when we pass the plate around, and we also make a big pitch for the musicians' CDs and recordings, which is perfect. CDs, nobody buys CDs anymore, so you can go to Catie's social networks or website and find out how to download her many records that have been so lauded by so many people and featured on all kinds of TV programs. And Catie, again, thank you so much for being with us, and it's just so great. We want to have you back for more of a feature, and I'm so glad you were able to join us with Barry today. So take it away, and be generous, everybody. Dig deep and go to our website to donate.
Thank you so much, Dean. And Barry, it was great to hear you. This is a song I wrote after a big storm when my kids were young. This is called Sing. Heaven knows, this little girl who once was afraid of spiders. Off she'll go into the world with the strength inside her to sing through all the danger, through all the thunder and the pouring rain. We sing to draw a circle around us if trouble has found us. Sing. They ring the bells to move us along. Find some soft grass to dream on. The wishing well will keep your heart strong. Find some good friends to lean on and sing through all the danger, through all the thunder and the pouring rain. We sing to draw a circle around us when trouble has found us. Sing Go bravely, oh my dear, for the night is always near. We're walking down the path toward home, through the thorns and foul weather. Heaven knows, we don't walk alone. We are on this path together. So sing through all the danger, through all the thunder and the pouring rain. We sing to draw a circle around us when trouble has found us. Sing, sing, oh. Thank you.
Thank you, Catie. Thank you so much. This virtual thing really is not like the real thing, but it also lights up the possibilities of us at church having up on the screen the likes of Magpie or Emma's Revolution, Pat and Sandy, anytime we want them. I'm sure they'd spend an hour with us and not have to travel all the way to Boston. But just on the subject of music, everybody knows that we had to cancel 3 different concerts. We were going to do a 100th anniversary concert series featuring Eliza Gilkyson, Fulani Haynes Jazz Collaborative, and finally, the most exciting one was going to be on May 31st, Luis Enrique Mejia Godoy from Nicaragua. I said the word cancel and I misspoke. Postpone, not cancel. And I say that about everything that's going on here. Barry and Catie, I hope we get to have you in person sometime in the near future when the coast is clear, so to speak. I want to take this moment before the Q&A and just if you'd like to ask a question, the chat room is being hosted and purveyed by the amazing Charlie Welch. And before I talk about the schedule coming up, just talk for a moment about Charlie Welch, who has stepped up to be on Community Church's board of directors. And also, I'll just mention that Charlie has refurbished and sent to El Salvador with me 13 or 14 computers for villages to set up computers for students. And I'm ever grateful to Charlie for that. And for his organization, which is called Text Change, which does that for all kinds of radical organizations throughout the world, just refurbishes gently used equipment and sends it all over the place. And thank you, Charlie, for your help this morning. So questions in the chat room while I read down our upcoming events. Next Sunday is Earth Day, and Richard Rosen is speaking to us. Richard, I believe, is with us this morning, somewhere there, and he's talking about climate change. And that happens to be Earth Day as well. And the musician is oh, I can't, Paul Kaplan. The next day after that is Mother's Day. And Reverend Adrian Barry Burton, one of the preeminent Boston African-American preachers, they call her pulpit supply preachers, is going to be with us. Also, after that, on May 3rd, who's also with us here is Judith Woodruff, speaking about the red and green of May Day. And she has a wonderful slide display to talk about labor and about the Great Depression. The Sunday after that is New England Witness for Peace. Lee Schlenker is the speaker, a young man who's speaking on Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. The one after that is by request of our own Dave Lewitt, and it's a program about green burials. And there's an organization called Green Burials Massachusetts who will be presenting. And on that day, the musician is someone who deals in a comedic way with the subject of death very handsomely. His name is David Dodson. He's one of my best friends from Camden, Maine. Green burials is the subject. And May 31st is going to be me talking about all this stuff. Treasures from Community Churches Archives. And maybe there will be some audio as well, excerpts from Donald Lothrop's sermons. So we've got a full plate coming ahead, and nothing is going to stop us. So join us, and as soon as we can come together live in person, I hope that you will come down to Copley Square, or else by that time we'll have this thing completely down and be able to broadcast it live all the time. And that is definitely my hope and plan. And we had budgeted for that, but the budget's out the window right now. But we will make that happen. It doesn't cost much money. We're not spending anything on this. It's just right on everybody's computer. So any questions for Barry, either through the chat room, or if you would like to just raise your hand, we can find you and unmute you, if I'm able to. Dave Lewitt, I will unmute you.
Yeah, Barry, thank you very much.
Barry, can you hear Dave?
Can you hear me?
Oh, Barry's got to be unmuted too.
Hello.
Barry, can you hear Dave?
Hello, Barry, can you hear me? I can't hear you.
I'll keep trying to unmute Barry, but go ahead. He can hear you.
Okay. All right. So Barry, it seems to me that the Supreme Court is more biased than just originalism or Bible. One of the big things, of course, is elitism. Leaning toward corporate interests. And so, my feeling is that the Supreme Court should disappear. So I would like to know what your thoughts are if the Supreme Court were simply abolished. We would have a number of appeals courts around the country. But what would be wrong with that?
Yeah, Dave, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the abolition of the Supreme Court is one remedy. And I certainly don't disagree that its corporate interests are enormous and obvious. Here's my alternative. And I was not always in favor of this, but I think we need to expand the size of the Supreme Court. We need to make sure that when we get a new president and we get a Senate that is more representative of the people of this country, which could come all in November, we will be in a position to expand the court. And even some progressive critics of the expansion of the court, they say things to me like, well, if you expand it to 15, then the next time there's a Republican president, she or he will expand it to 25. And although that's an interesting hypothetical, I'm not sure that it's a bad one, because if there are more people in the court, perhaps we would get away from the elitism which I assume you also mean almost everybody on the court attended an Ivy League law school. There's nobody from the University of Alabama's law school there. In the Eisenhower years, he would appoint people who weren't even law professors or judges on appeals court, which is the tendency now. He would take people from business and he would appoint a diversity of people. You know, the Supreme Court, Dave, is the only court where you don't have to be an attorney to be on the court. You don't have to be an attorney. And for years in Washington, there used to be a guy who would testify at every hearing on a Supreme Court appointment just to say, you shouldn't have a lawyer. You should have someone who's smart, but not a lawyer. And so there are some variations that I think would get there. The idea of abolishing it completely would take a constitutional amendment. That's difficult. We know that from the difficulty with getting the Equal Rights Amendment approved. But your sentiment is well taken. And I think there are some ways to deflect the interest of some of the current ultra-conservative corporatists on the Supreme Court now without abolishing the whole thing.
Just one more comment on that.
Sure.
I think that the United States with 320 million people is just too damn many. It's too big to manage in a democratic way. I am a regionalist, if you will.
Sure.
So if you were to eliminate the Supreme Court, which is a federal thing, you would be thrown back on regional courts, right?
That's true.
11 district courts or something like that. What's wrong with that?
Well, I mean, I think one of the problems with that I could see, and I mean, there are people who actually believe, and there are days, believe me, when I get up in the morning, watch what the president has done overnight, and then say, maybe we should just have allowed certain states to leave the union and not even fought it. We should. But the problem is, what happens then in places where the populace is much more conservative than the population generally? Would, for example, a circuit that covers Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, for example, would they have been willing to support marriage equality? There are plenty of people, and we were involved in a number of lawsuits at Americans United involving a judge in Alabama who refused to grant marriage licenses for gay couples after the Obergefell decision that legalized same-sex marriage in the entire country. So I think you would lose something, and you'd end up treating some people in some parts of the country as second-class citizens. I understand where you're going, but I think ultimately we have to have, unless we split the country in half or into regions, we have to have somebody who can be the final referee and do the right thing for everyone.
Now, there are lots of countries that are splitting up, like Catalonia in Spain, and the whole Soviet Union split up, and
Yep.
to many countries, and Scotland is splitting off from the United Kingdom, and so forth. Ireland has been going on for a long time, splitting off from the United Kingdom. And so what's wrong with the United States of New England?
Well, nothing about the United States of New England, but I'm worried about the United States of the Deep South and whether everyone would be treated fairly there. And but it's certainly worth talking about. And there was about 2 or 3 years ago, a guy wrote a book about separating the country just in half. And he couldn't even get politicians to take a position on whether that was any good, whether that was a good or bad idea. They considered the idea itself so controversial. So it's a real grassroots effort. that it would take to do what you propose. Grassroots efforts are the only thing that ever matters. Much as I spent a lot of time in Washington with a lot of politicians, ultimately politicians do not lead the country. Politicians listen to people who are leading the country, and as a result, they eventually can do the right thing. But it takes organizing from the people to the government, because the government ain't about to give up any of its power, none.
Okay, thank you, Barry.
Okay, it's Dean again. Is there anybody else who has a question or a comment? I see Jim and Ken. Let me start with Jim and then Ken, okay?
Can you hear
Go
me?
ahead, Jim.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Jim.
I'm talking. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Ask Dean if he can hear me.
I can hear you, Jim.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
Oh, so
go ahead.
the question is kind of part of what's being talked about. We're seeing a president that, at least in my opinion, is way past what a president of our country was intended to be. This guy is acting like some kind of a king or something and getting away with it. Any comments on that?
Well, the president, Jim, does seem to think that he is a monarch, that he is a king. When he said last week for a while, something he was corrected himself in part in order to make another point a few days later. He thought he could do anything. He thought he could open the entire country, even if governors said, wait a minute, it's not safe for us to open the country, our state. He thought he had the power to impose and open the country, open business mentality. He doesn't have that authority. There is something called the 10th Amendment. 10th Amendment says that rights that are not enumerated in the Bill of Rights are allowed to be adjudicated by the states and even by the people. The 9th Amendment, also kind of a forgotten amendment, says that there are specific rights not listed in the Bill of Rights that are to remain with the states and the people. But this guy doesn't think that. He thinks he has the power to do anything, and he does not. There's so many things that I find deeply horrendous about this president, including his power grabs, including his complete lack of empathy for anyone, that I do find, I didn't want to go into a lot of detail about it because I might get angry, but he just does not understand the power that he has, nor does he understand the power that he does not have. And I think the country is all the worse for it. All the worse for it.
I agree. Yeah.
Okay, Ken, go ahead. Can I hear you?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to introduce a topic which is relevant to the talk and see what comments Barry would have on this. For many years in Massachusetts, I was involved in an effort to repeal a state statute having to do with religious exemptions to medical care for children. This had been on the books for about 20 years. It was introduced, shepherded through the legislature here in Massachusetts by the Christian Science Church. These state religious exemption laws to medical care for children were in most states around the country. And there was a Christian Science boy here in Massachusetts who died of a bowel obstruction. And the parents through the church relied on this religious exemption that they did not have to provide medical care for children if they substituted prayer. And so we got that repealed. It took 5 years, constant advocacy. There's still other states around the country that have these laws. The Congress in the 80s passed a law which allowed states to create these state religious
Right.
exemptions at their discretion. Now in Massachusetts, we're trying to repeal religious exemptions to vaccinations for children, which exist in many states. Some of the states have just repealed these laws, but these laws are actually now even more relevant to the current vaccination issue. So I just wondered if you had any comments or familiarity with this issue.
No, I do, and I must say that I think we've reached a point where these religious exemptions for healthcare simply ought to be abandoned, and that the federal law that permits states to do what you just described probably needs to be repealed. And 25 years ago, I was a little more open and willing to think, well, maybe this is an exemption that ought to be in the law, but I can't support it anymore. And I think what happens is now it's metastasized into this ridiculous argument we're having right now about churches who do not want to do what the Community Church of Boston is doing, don't want to find another way to communicate its services. So we have lawsuits being filed, most recently in California, by 2 ministers who say, we want to be open. It is essential to our understanding of Scripture that we be able to see people in person and we be able to lay hands on them in order to heal them and to baptize them, because you can't do a baptism over the internet. And they filed this lawsuit, and I suspect they're going to lose it. And there have been enormous battles around the country in the last week or so where people say, we demand the right to be exempt from any stay-at-home order if we're a church, if we're a synagogue or a mosque. And in an own fumbling way, just yesterday, the president seemed to suggest he was kind of open to that because maybe it was an essential service, and tattoo parlors and gun shows and the other ridiculous things that are considered essential in this climate. But there's a big fight going on, and I don't take any pleasure in the fact that some of the ministers and lawyers for one of the churches that have been most defiant here have now caught the coronavirus. And you would think that the evidence of what can happen with these mass gatherings would be sufficient for people, and 95% of churches and synagogues have no problem with meeting the way we're meeting. But for those that do, it's just a absolute petri dish of viral contamination to meet. I don't generally think much of Mike Pence, but I do think when he spoke right before Easter and reminded people in his many Christian churches that Jesus said, wherever 2 or more are gathered, there am I. 2 or more are gathered. You don't need 10 or 50 or 300 people, as we saw in Easter in 1 or 2 churches in Louisiana. They just can't be justified. These religious exemptions have got to go.
Just a quick follow-up. These religious exemption laws to medical care for children really had severe consequences. There were many children around the country who died of easily curable medical diseases, including meningitis, diphtheria, and so forth. Over 100 of not only the Christian Science Church, but various sects that did not believe in medical care and complete reliance on prayer. So these laws were murderous, basically. Also here in Massachusetts, a boy died of diphtheria due to lack of vaccination, the son of a Christian Scientist. due to lack of vaccination. So this is a fairly, important issue in terms of church-state constitutionalism. The First Amendment allows free exercise of religion, but not free exercise of belief, but not necessarily behavior. And also it includes the Establishment Clause, which requires that no church should be recognized over any other church. So just wanted to add that in.
No, that's very important. One of the things that some of these churches during the pandemic are arguing is that there is a federal law called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It was intended, I think I can safely say, I think I was there at the genesis of this bill. Orrin Hatch, Ted Kennedy, got a couple of people together the day after a Supreme Court decision that seemed to reject the idea that you could claim a religious exemption to certain drug laws. And they did a sweeping decision that pretty much gutted the possibility of people, for example, Muslim firefighters who wanted to wear a beard, prisoners who wanted to wear a beard. And we thought that needed to be corrected, but now it's being misinterpreted by courts, including the Supreme Court, to cover virtually anything else. Some of you are familiar with the Hobby Lobby case, where this Religious Freedom Restoration Act was held to apply to an arts and crafts company that wanted to give its women employees no coverage for the most effective contraceptives. They said it's our religious belief, proving that craft stores and apparently can have religious beliefs, and that they won the case, I think 5-4, where they could allow, under the Affordable Care Act, to deny coverage to women employees around the country. Shameful decision, one of those 5-4 decisions that might have turned out differently had even prior to the most recent appointments of Neil Gorsuch and it's hard to even speak his name, before they even got on the court. I hope Catie's still with us. I just wanted to say something. Yeah, I just wanted to say something. We do know each other very well. I listened to Catie's music for a long time, and we finally met at a PFLAG convention out in Salt Lake City, Utah. And some years ago, I was having lunch with the late John Jennings, who was a great, great musician. And I said to John, why don't we have a concert, raise a little money here in Washington? And he said, well, that's okay, but why don't we have 50 concerts on the same weekend, one in every state, and raise money that way? And I looked at him and I thought, well, geez, who would possibly do that? And he said, well, I'm sure we could come up with someone. What we did was find Catie, and Catie did 3 years worth of concerts. In the first year, it was done in every state, except I think we ended up having a hootenanny in Alaska because they didn't know any Alaskan artists. And but there was a fabulous series of events, hundreds of concerts over the course of 3 years with hundreds of musicians and comedians, and it was a wonderful event. It was called Voices United for Separation of Church and State, and one of the proudest things I was a part of during my 25 years at Americans United.
Barry, I'd like to ask you the following. We were founded in 1920, and the whole founding principle was committed, engaged church, committed, engaged in social change. And at the beginning of the history of the church, it looked a lot like a church service. You know, it had organ, and it had classical music, and it had something like a secularish doxology, and it had hymns that were sort of lyrics manipulated to not be as religious so we were founded as what's called a Chapter 138 organization under the laws of Massachusetts, and we still have the charter that declares us as such. But over the years, you know, what I'm getting to is my question: what is a church? And there was a time when we had to deal with this question when we had some issue about parking with a neighbor who happened to be highly connected in the city hall, and they went to the Board of Assessors and said, "This is not a church." And the city of Boston actually revoked our status as a church until we hired a lawyer to go through the history of the church with the Board of Assessors and reestablish our tax exemption. And it happened in 1980. It was a tough moment, and it started with just some complaining neighbor about a parking space. So what is a church? Are we a church?
Yes.
Or are we just a old radical club?
Well, nothing wrong with being an old radical club, but the truth is you are a church. And you know how you determine whether you're a church? You say you're a church. Let's say that you wanted to have some churches, as you know, have breakaways. Like, let's say two of the people that were watching this said, really, really dislike hearing from Barry Lynn. We are breaking away. We're going to form Community Church 2. What they would have to do is simply file a statement, not any papers, with the Internal Revenue saying we're called Community Church 2, and they would automatically be granted a tax exemption. Now, then you'd say, well, if they're a tax exempt church, and tax exemptions are usually granted under, in the federal law, under something called a 501c3 status, what do they have to report? Well, if you're a normal 501c3, like Americans United for Separation of Church and State is, or the Sierra Club is, you have to report a lot of information. Your largest donors, you have to report the amount of money you spend on contacting state or local or national figures, and you file a report, and everybody can see it. If you're a church, however, you don't have to file anything. So I was curious about one of these churches that I referenced a question or two ago that believe they have the right to stay open during the pandemic. And I thought, I wonder, the minister of this church in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, he said his latest thing was, when you get your government stimulus check, you should turn it over to ministers or missionaries. And he announced that he and his spouse were turning over their checks. So I thought, I wonder, what does he get paid as the pastor of this large church? But I couldn't find it, because that kind of information is not available because he is a church. There were efforts by courts to decide what a church was. There was a famous set of cases in Philadelphia. There's an organization called MOVE. Some of your viewers probably know about it. And Mayor Wilson Goode was the mayor of Philadelphia. He got so mad about it, he eventually firebombed several blocks of the city of Philadelphia in order to destroy the MOVE facilities. And MOVE was run by a gentleman named Joseph Africa, the predominantly African-American organization. And he went to court claiming he was a church, as I think he was. And the Third Circuit Court of Appeals in protracted legislation, what other kind is there, tried to define what a church was. And eventually they just gave up. They couldn't define it. So if you apply to be a church, you are one. If you're a church, you don't have to tell people much of anything about who you are, what monies you raise, what you spend your money on. And so that's the long answer to your short question. What is a church?
I see the light.
Hey, look, the light just came on behind you.
Yeah,
You
I
have
know.
extraordinary powers.
computer
I didn't
does
know
that.
that.
Yeah,
But I've known that
do I have a
already.
halo on my head now?
Okay.
No, I just have
give
a
or
hat that
take.
says "The Revolution."
I see that.
So we're getting to lunchtime. Usually we have Luis Guzman, who prepares lovely lunch for us. And this is when we bring out the tables and we get ready to break bread a little bit. We can't do that, but we can go downstairs and have lunch, or at least I can. Or just as a way of saying the meeting is adjourned, I want to thank everybody for joining us. There's about 15 on the Zoom and another 15 or so on the YouTube live feed, which will be recorded and available for anybody who wants to see it later. I want to urge you all to spend all this extra time you have to make 2 phone calls tomorrow to your state rep and your state senator, and tell them that vulnerable prisoners need to be out of the prisons. There has been an attempt at legislation, but it hasn't succeeded. I'm not even sure if they're in session or if they plan to be in virtual session, but there is legislation being put forward, and just ask them to put that on the top of their list. It's truly a death sentence for some of these older lifers who are in bad health already because of the horrible health situation in prisons and the horrible food they're fed. So that's my little urging to you to take some time to do that. Barry, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope we can have you live and in person sometime soon. We'd love to host you here at the community church. Everybody, look out for upcoming events that have been postponed, not canceled, and join us on Sundays. We're here at 11, and we plan to do the best we can to, in the most professional way we can, continue this and continue our reach of this wonderful programming that we're so honored to be able to have. Thank you, Barry. And
thank you.
One more thing for everybody. I'm thinking of setting up a Zoom chat, a community church Zoom chat. Maybe it's hard to know exactly when would be the best time. This would be just check in. How is everybody doing? Do you need anything? It's hard to make all the phone calls to everybody to find out if everybody's okay. We have among our membership and our greater audience a lot of folks who are seniors, who live by themselves, who live on a fixed income. We also have about a dozen folks who are regular attendees who are marginal in some way because of homelessness or because of almost homelessness, live in abandoned places without utilities because of just being out of prison. And it's really, for me, a great anxiety not to be able to be in touch with them, because when you see them is when they come in on a Sunday. So I'm thinking about, and please call me or email me if you have some ideas about how to do this, just to check in and a hello. Maybe at noon. I'm just thinking out loud. On a couple days a week, something like that. Let's think about that, and let's talk about that as a board David, the next time we talk together.
Okay, yeah, send me, put that in some kind of email and send it to me.
Okay.
I'll put it in the agenda.
And Ron, did you hear that too?
Which Ron is that?
That Ron, yes, that other board member. And Judith,
Yeah,
well.
Cheers.
I heard that.
Meeting at the building soon be over, all over this world. Meeting at the building, amen, hallelujah, amen, 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 amen. And as the South African late Joseph Salabalala would say, hallelujah. End the meeting.
Wonderful.